The course addresses the whole idea of the supposed conflict between faith and science I think the title reflects it in some ways. It's called The Fundamentals of Science at the Foundations of Faith. The idea being that if you really want to get at the core of questions of faith, you need to phrase your questions in a very kind of specific way and hone them carefully. And I think science over the centuries has taught us a lot about how to be very attentive to observations, how to pose questions, and how to assess the quality of our answers. And my sense in working with a lot of seminarians is that sometimes we can be kind of sloppy when we talk about the faith. Are we really aware of the experiences that we have? Are we aware of the kinds of questions to ask, and then to really weigh the answers that we have? So I think it's the methodology and the epistemology of science that aids faith rather than there being any sort of conflict. The background I bring to the course is the fact that before entering seminary, I was trained and worked for a couple of years as an astrophysicist. Then going into seminary, after I finished and was ordained, I worked pretty extensively in formation, so as a spiritual director and a formation advisor, as well as teaching scripture. And so I think as you talk about the interface of science and religion, you really need to consider not only the science background, but also how does a seminarian take in and wrestle with those questions at a spiritual level.
Our course is titled The Transfigured Brain, the relationship between brain science, ritual, and mysticism. I have been pursuing in an informal way how brain science, how neurology relates to liturgy and to ritual music for about 14 years. So this is kind of a chance for me to do it in a very systematic way. I think that in doing so, it will be helpful, A, to my ministry as music director and working intimately with liturgy at the seminary. And so that hopefully will carry over to the students. But it will also be helpful in this particular course, but also in some of the other courses that I teach. I bring in how liturgical music and how ritual affects the brain and why that is important in preparing liturgies and how liturgies are carried out.
The course that I'm teaching that is particularly relevant to our meeting here is on the subject of marriage and human sexuality. And it's different from other courses in that there are very specific scientific realities involved. When we come to ask questions about intimacy and children, naturally the issue of fertility and what is appropriate and what is permissible in regard to understanding and making use of one's fertility arises, as well as the question of pregnancy and how one relates to and understands this the beautiful question of a developing new life. And so, in addition to the theology and the spirituality of the sacrament of matrimony, questions such as genetics, how does the unique and absolutely distinct individuality of two completely different individuals come together in a way that creates someone absolutely unique and distinct? How does human genetics work? How does this represent a wonderful gift from God that is constantly reshuffling the deck of possibilities as far as humanity is concerned? But also, what are the difficulties one may encounter in terms of genetic defects and things to be aware of in terms of problems in pregnancy? This involves medicine. This involves very specific scientific questions. I mentioned genetics. There's also embryology. There's the question of endocrinology, the effect of hormones on creating especially the natural and beautiful and complex cycle of fertility in women, and to some extent how that is present in men as well. Those issues need to be brought into one's discussion of marriage and sexuality, and yet they are science. So how then can we make science beautiful, not just technical, not just a question of, well, this hormone triggers this, and then that's the effect, but how can this be perceived as a part of an intricate cycle that is itself a manifestation of an ongoing process of change and transformation that mirrors the love of God Himself? How do we make science beautiful and interesting? And in the same way, in every family, one spouse will die before the other. Care for your marriage partner will involve things like deciding on who's going to get to make responsible decisions if the other partner can't speak, questions of informed consent and durable power of attorney and determining a proxy for decision making. These are issues that pertain not only to spouses but also to care of one's parents and unfortunately also occasionally to care of one's children. So things at the other end of life, especially involving what do we mean by things like the persistent vegetative state? How does that differ from coma, from a progressive deterioration of one's mental faculties? What is brain death, and what happens when the family is confronted with a physician who says we have to think about organ donation? These are all medical questions, but at the same time, they are profoundly important questions about the presence of Christ at the end of life and making choices that really are for a deepening union with God. There again, how to make science and these often difficult scientific realities comprehensible and at the same time even attractive and beautiful as a reflection of God's plan for humankind.
I think my course is a corrective to the notion that science and religion are at odds in three ways, but it all comes down to one very practical point. So first, my students are going to look at the history and philosophy of science to show how the contemporary history and philosophy of science opens up a space for faith in the process of coming to objective knowledge. So science itself is a faith and uses belief, so why can't theology? Second, we're going to look at the contemporary cosmology to show how contemporary cosmology opens up a space for rational belief in a creator. It doesn't prove anything, but it opens up that space. So science leads to the threshold of belief, and faith can illuminate what science shows. And last, we're going to go right into the belly of evolution. And we're going to look at how engaging with evolutionary theory, rather than dismissing it, can really open up a parallel between how natural history has unfolded, how God has worked in salvation history, always respecting the freedom of people, and how God works in people's lives, always respecting their freedom. And out of that, I think they're going to come up with a better theology of suffering. But in the end, what I think is going to happen as a result of all of that is the seminarians and the priests will be able to be more attentive to people in their struggles, and will have more tools for helping people in their struggles. So the thesis of the course, that science and religion are not at odds with one another, will be proved through the fruit of pastoral ministry, that when you engage in both of these, you'll be more effective in your pastoral ministry. And that's the ultimate goal of engaging in science and theology at the same time.
I have a doctorate in microbiology, and I have always approached my work at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology through the lens of a scientist. I try in my liturgical courses to help students see theoretical connections with their actual experience of liturgy. And with that background in the natural sciences, it's of particular interest to me, a new field in science, relatively new, known as neuroaesthetics. And we hope to use this, some insights from this field of neuroaesthetics in a new course we're developing in liturgy. The depth of the field of neuroaesthetics is somewhat complicated, so we're going to try to take an overarching view, looking at some basic principles that the field of neuroaesthetics is trying to discover. Specifically relevant to Catholic worship and Catholic liturgy are thoughts and reflections on an experience of awe that is ubiquitous.